Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1469, I believe. Yeah. 1469. So we finished parenthesis number 1 on top of the page. To sum up, the Rebbe Rashab is saying, Yesh lekadav zois, to bring this a bit closer, a little more palatable, the idea that we've been discussing, that you have the nefesh as it engages and interacts, manifests in the body to the point that it is affected by the experiences of the body, namely its pleasure and its pain. And then there's a level of the nefesh that's not affected by it. What he calls the atzmi, the keich ruchni, let's call this the nefesh haruchni atzma, or what he called before atzmi saruchni, the nefesh. Different expressions for it. And then there's the part that is manifest, the ruchni shebegashmi. So to Yesh lekadav zeis, he gave the example is from Mashan. I don't know if you can call it an example. He doesn't use dugma. He says we can relate to this more from what we see, that when a person is immersed, is preoccupied, maybe even better word, preoccupied, tirda. When a person is preoccupied, and he gave the example of tirda sasechel, which means immersed with your mind and preoccupied, he'll not feel the pain in one of his limbs if there is a pain. So what do you see from this? That indicates that the time when the nefesh is so-called transcending and somewhat beyond its manifestation in the geshem of the guf, it's not margish called kachas mikri aguf. It doesn't feel that much the mikri aguf, so he's giving a very practical application, a practical experience of that. Even when the neshama is in the guf, we're not talking now in any ruchnisdik way. When a person is preoccupied, you see the nefesh is not as engaged with the guf and therefore with the experiences of the body. That's the bottom line. So I think I want to emphasize it's not an example. It's actually it's not an example as a mashal. What I mean by example, it's not a metaphor. It's an example of an actual experience where you're experiencing more than nefesh beyond its interaction with the body due to the preoccupation of the activity that you're involved in, and namely the example he gives is of tirdas haseichel. Okay. Which means when a person, let's say, is not preoccupied, and they are more in a more gashmisdik state, they will feel that pain. Fine. Then came the next thing. V'chein muvan mizeh. Now, v'chein muvan mizeh does not mean that he's giving another scenario that is considered to be above. The Chem Uvim is to me sounds like he's coming to say another thing we've learned from this is I was thinking about it. I asked yesterday, we don't understand the comparison. Das is what creates the bond and the connection between the seichel and the midas. So the example we spoke before about that, where the soul is engaging with the body. What is that in the faculties? That would be das, that binds and causes an impact, an emotional hispilus, an emotional effect, emotional stimulation in the midas. The lula is kashus, das lo yispal mizeh. So a person could intellectually understand something, they won't be affected by it. So das serves that role. So as far as the context of what he's saying here, yes, that's a good parallel. Das is the parallel of neshama, of nefesh, as it engages with the body, and it is affected by the body. Same thing, das causes the effect of the spilus. But as I said, to me, it sounded like there's more here. Not just coming to make a parallel. That it could be he wants to come and say that das perhaps is the mere fact that a person is connected to something. Like he said before, when you're preoccupied with your mind, so it doesn't allow you to feel. But there's also the other way around. When das is in motion, das creates that connection, that connection between nefesh and guf, much more in the context of seichel and midas. So perhaps he's coming to say that das is actually one of the elements that binds body, soul, and body, or in this case, moichin and midas, as he puts it. Because he concludes, so the fact that das does this connection means, but without das, you wouldn't have that connection. So you see that there are two levels in the elements of how these two entities interact with each other. But as I said, maybe more of this will become understood as we go along. Bottom line, the parentheses came to make 2 points. One is he gave an actual scenario of where a person is more immersed, more preoccupied, and therefore there is not so spilus memikre aguf from the experiences of the body. And the second point is the movement is the role of das in this whole process, which tells us that mikre aguf rak beruchni sanefesh hamislabish b'adam le be'etzem aruchni, because you can have, for example, the intellect is working. If the intellect doesn't have das, it's not going to be there won't be a spilus in the midas. So he's comparing that to the spilus in mikre haguf. Okay. Okay. I'm ready to move on. Another parenthesis now. He's going to speak about this more on a spiritual level, meaning more in avodah. Till now, this was being discussed more in terms of, lack of a better word, I would guess it like the anatomy of it all, or the anatomy, or the structure, the structural interaction. Now he's going to talk about it somewhat more in avodah, looks like to me. Which till now I wasn't talking about the avodah. He was talking more, like I said, do we feel? Does the nefesh change or is affected by the bodily experiences? So now comes the next parenthesis. One more thing about das that I thought of, maybe I said it already, just rethinking it again. The fact that midas don't get stimulated automatically, and you need hiskashus, the das that causes that spilus, tells you that there are levels that are not affected. That's another element that you learn from that. Remember, in other words, the fact that the nefesh enters the body doesn't automatically mean that the nefesh is affected by the body. And the similarity to that is in das. Just because you understand an idea doesn't mean that your midas are going to be excited by it. You need another effort, the das connection, to make that happen. I think that's another point that he may be wanting to emphasize. Because you would think if one thing enters into another, automatically they should both affect each other. But it's not necessarily the case. Das proves that, because das means you need an extra element of das to create a stimulation, so to speak, in the midas, which is like the seichel nefesh affecting. Yeah. Like we said earlier, that when a person is happy, or shmua tova, when they hear a good piece of news, it affects their body. But it's not automatic, because you need to have that connection. The connection that's made, like das is the connection between moichin and midas. Okay, just wanted to add that. Let's go to the next parentheses now. So the line begins, chulu. You see the end of a parenthesis, you see immediately the beginning of a new parenthesis. So it's actually two parentheses, one after another. You don't see that so often, but you do find that in Chassidus number of times. She says like this now. V'hinei, and the pages can be followed if you want to follow at ayinbeis.com. She says like this. V'hinei beruchnius yashleimer gamkein. In ruchnius, now what he means by ruchnius here, he's talking here, b'chlal, the neshama nefesh is ruchni. Ruchni sheberuchni is gashmi sheberuchni is ruchni shebegashmis. He means here ruchnis, he means avoided ruchnis. You'll see. It doesn't just mean spiritual. He means spiritual is in context in how neshamas are connected to godliness part of it. Till now, he wasn't talking about godliness. He was talking about does the body and soul impact each other. Says beruchni sheshlemer gamkein. You can also say the masha neshama nimsheches achar aguf. The neshama that in nimsheches that follows the body, meaning the neshama is sent to enter inside of a body, and it extends itself to there. Nimsheches is drawn achar aguf. Zel madrega tachtein sheben neshama. So what he means here, nimsheches achar aguf, needs explanation. What does that mean exactly? We learned earlier when we spoke about the shemen and psila. So he said that the wick is drawn to the oil, and the oil is drawn into the wick. So it sounds like to me that when he says nimsheches achar aguf, he means that when God says to the soul, I want you to enter into a body, even though initially the soul doesn't want to do so, it's al korcha chatachai, but once the soul does so, it's not a battle. The soul does so peacefully, and you see from the moment of conception, and the soul is beginning to work with the body, or like we see in our lives, your soul is drawn to give life. It's like an energy that's dedicated to energize your body. It's not something you have to constantly be drawing. It's not like something you have to constantly find. Where's my soul? My soul is within me, and it's nimsheches achar aguf. But that's the pure biological function of the neshama as it goes drawn toward the body. So he says it's coming from that's the target tachtenos sheben neshama. Like we learned earlier, we're not talking about the neshama as it is on its own. It's lower levels of the neshama that engage with and interact with the body. We'll understand this as we go along. So let's learn inside, and I think it will become clear. Like he says, L'kutei Torah lahavin inyan haposuk mikel kamoicha. So I believe this is a mimer in L'kutei Torah Yom Kippur, I think. I'm almost sure it's a Yom Kippur mimer. So there's a mimer that starts lahavin inyan mikel kamoicha. So what does he say there? The neshama she'im madrega tachtena shenikra gasas haruach. It's coming back. Now we know gasas haruach. Remember earlier on the previous page, he used gasas haruach as an example of gashmi sheberuchnis. Like it's gas, it's thick, but it's in ruchnis. It's the thickness within ruchnis. So he says that the neshama, the way it's in the lower level, in a state of gas haruach, harihu melubeshes ma'oid. It's very much engaged with and very much manifest and enclosed within the guf. In other words, the different levels of the soul engage on different levels, in different manner, in different states of intensity with the body. Higher levels of the neshama remain somewhat separate, remain somewhat, I would say, I just want to say aloof, more transcendent. And there are parts of the neshama that engage more. So, for example, just to use a very practical example, when a person is eating a meal and they really enjoy the meal, so it's not just the body that's eating, the spirit is also involved because that person doesn't eat. But it's a very big difference, for example, how nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida, you can imagine that chai and yechida, or even neshama and ruach, are not as immersed in that juicy steak as the pleasure of, let's say, a lower level of the nefesh. There are parts of the nefesh, of the soul, that are more engaged and more involved in that particular, I'm not talking about anything, God forbid, prohibited. But that particular indulgence, that particular pleasure. Like we learned before, that the pleasure of the body also affects the body, then it's nefesh, and vice versa. So but what level of the nefesh? It's a lower level of the nefesh, as we learned. To say that when you take, when the guf is having pleasure, or pain for that matter, but pleasure in something in this world, to say that affects the chida and the levels of etzma neshama and the chelik alekam and mal mamish, that are all part of the divine, it can say that they're completely detached. No, of course they're affected by it somewhat, but they're not engaged in it. It's not melubeshes ma'oid. Melubeshes ma'oid, very involved. To give another example, let's say you have a friend, you have your child. Your child wants you to come and play a game with them. So you could do it just to make your child happy, but you're doing it very much in a detached way. You're there, but you can't say melubeshes ma'oid, you're really engaged and really involved and immersed. Or melubeshes ma'oid would be an example where you're really engaged and immersed in it. I'm not getting into which way it should be. I'm just pointing out that there are ways to engage in something in a more superficial and a more surface level way, and there's ways of engagement that are deeper. So far what he said here is that when you say the neshama nimsheches achar haguf, where the neshama is following the body, we're talking about the lower levels of the neshama, and he's bringing Likutei Torah, that's madreges taktein shenikar gasus haruach. That's why you call it gasus haruach. You're talking about ruach, which is something spirit, not talking about pure body. You're not talking about a physical experience, but it's gasus haruach. It's a thickened. It's a you can say it's a it's the word for it. It's more fagrept in Yiddish. You would say fagrept. The ruach, the spirit, is not as pure as when you're involved in something that's purely divine, purely holy. So it's gasus haruach, which is sometimes the word used for arrogance or for a person who's filled with themselves. Here he's not so using in the context of arrogance. He's using in the context of the ruach is somewhat materialized. It's materialistic. It's a materialistic spirit, if you wish. That's a good way to put it. Materialistic spirit. That's what he says. Look at the Torah. It's very manifest, very enclosed.
Congealed?
I use congealed sometimes where it's more solidified. Here, I don't know if I'd use congealed because this is more in quality. It's like the person's spirit is somewhat thick. It's like a thick spirit. I would call materialistic spirit, something like that. I mean, end of the day, it's not so much the word. I'm looking just to get that concept across. Okay. So that's one thing he just said. So I said, let's continue reading and let's see where this is going. See this as notes and thoughts of the Rebbe Rashab, which could be pretty brief and dense, on the ideas that we learned before, which we said come straight from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So Rebbe Rashab is sharing his thoughts on it. I'm going to try to develop it and flesh it out as much as possible. But let's first read it, and then we could see what we take from this. So now he adds another thing. Elsewhere it's explained like this. The Masher Kosev Nefesh Ki Sechta. So the pasuk says nefesh, when a nefesh will sin, will transgress, which of course is a strange statement. Does the nefesh transgress? As a matter of fact, in Zoyar, he says nefesh ki sechta tva. Tva means tmiya. He wonders, can a nefesh sin and transgress? But elsewhere it explains when it says nefesh ki sechta, what does it mean? It's referring to hu b'neshama debiyah, atzman. It's the neshama as it's in biyah itself. That's where you can say the word sechta. Remember, sechta doesn't only mean sin, it means also lacking something. But you definitely talk about the neshama on a lower level. Because like he's going to say now a line later, he says, because neshamas, aval neshamashim mebchinas atzilus shebebiyah. But neshama, as it comes from atzilus within biyah, we learned earlier atzilus within biyah, not just atzilus alone, atzilus within biyah. Eina sheyochim lechet v'over chaz v'shalom. They have no connection. There's no They're not capable of any sin or transgression, God forbid. The kolshke neshama is the Atzilus mamish. And for sure, souls of Atzilus itself, for sure, no, you can't say Nefesh Ki Sechta. So as soon as you say Nefesh Ki Sechta, you're talking about a Nefesh that's already engaged and somewhat enclosed in the garments of Biyah. We learned earlier about Atzilus Shebiyah and Biyah. I have to go back there to refresh my memory, but it was a few pages back where he spoke about that. I don't know how much it's relevant right now to go through the details of it, but it was when he spoke about the Ner, about the Neshama, Ner Avaya. Okay, I'll look at it up a little later. Let's go back here. Moshe Kosa Begeres HaKedesh, Simen Chaf, like he writes in the Geras HaKedesh, again, 20, the famous Geras HaKedesh 20, the Madregas Atzilus Mistalkes Ba'oven V'chet, Ba'oven HaChet, rather, Be'ez HaChet, sorry. I didn't read it correctly, Be'ez HaChet. That the level of Atzilus and Neshama is mistalik. During the time of a chet, that level is removed. Like, it's not, expires is not the right word. It essentially, it leaves during the time of a chet. I have to look up in a case in what context he says it. But bottom line, clearly, that higher levels of the neshama connected to Atzilus in Biyah, Atzilus itself, cannot be engaged with the time of a chet. The time of a chet means that that level has to be concealed. Because if it was revealed, there was no way that it could be there. First of all, either you couldn't sin, or if the sin happened, it cannot exist because it's too pure for that type of level. So it's called Istalkus HaAtzilus. Level of Atzilus. Okay, so what do we have now? The second point he made here, similar to the first one, that there's a level of neshama that remains engaged and a level that does not remain engaged. Of course, you're going to ask the immediate question, how could any level of the soul be connected to Achet? But that's the whole point that he's discussing here, that there is a relationship. Remember, we're talking about the neshama does come into the body, and the nefesh alikis and nefesh habamis do interact with each other. A big part of Tanya is about their battle. So they clearly are speaking to each other, and they're affected by each other. Before we learned about the shemen and the psila of the divine soul, the wick, engages with, and actually its intention is to harness the animal soul's the oil of the animal soul to fuel the divine. So clearly there's an engagement, and that's the purpose. In other words, the neshama, there are parts of the neshama that have to engage with the body and the animal soul. However, those are lower levels of the nefesh. That's what he's saying here. That's so far what he said so far. So he's already bringing here the avodah part of it. He is talking here the avodah because he clearly is talking about chet. He's not just speaking about the biology of a soul and a body. You know, till now you could say it was the biology, that the blood, the nefesh, its power to reveal, it comes into the body and engages with the body. It feels its pain and pleasure and pain. But now he's talking about the avodah of it more. So he says now like this, Omnom, however, Lifel b'nefesh habamis habir v'tikun, which is the theme that we've been discussing overall, this whole idea, to impact and to cause in the animal soul, bir v'tikun, which is a clarity, a separation, a refinement, and a repair, which is the whole point of the nefesh alikis, of the divine soul, refining the animal soul, ubederech klal, and in general, habitl, to cause the bitl of the nefesh habamis, that the nefesh habamis should change its essential personality and what's the word I want to say? Refined bitl is sublimated, to be sublimated. Like love b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, which we discussed earlier. The avahafta shemal kecha, the ava, that also the animal soul goes along and fuels and adds to the love of God. So to cause that type of effect on the Nefesh Abamis, and if you remember the operative question on page 1466 is how do you do that? And that's where the whole discussion began. You do that with Shema Yisrael, with the contemplation on Hashem Echad, Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, Yesh Ma'ayin. All this is coming to explain Yesh Ma'ayin and Yesh Mi and the engagement between the effect. Does it affect the Elokus, its interaction with existence, or doesn't affect? And the lower levels it does affect. So he's now coming back to that discussion. So clearly, you have here a good indicator, even though the Rebbe Rashab, as I said, at the end of Hemshech Ayin Beis does not completely or does not finish the whole picture, but this parenthesis tells us that we should be thinking about that this is all coming to explain the interaction between the divine soul and the animal soul. So now he's saying, so the first thing is that the lower levels of the soul are what connect to the body. And to chet with is a chet with it, which of course comes from the animal soul. Now he's saying to cause birur and tikkun and the general bittul to the point of loving God, even with the animal soul, ima yes. So that he didn't finish the sentence. He's saying the omnam. So even though sheyesh lemer, even though you can say shezeu gamken ha'ikar b'neshamas debiyah, you could say that this primary effort is neshamas abiyah. Like he just explained why the neshamas elu hu sheikir dasim b'shvil habirur b'derech mamata l'mayla. Like we just said, Nefesh Ki Sechta, where does that apply to neshamas and biyah? Not atzilus and biyah, not atzilus, because that's where the neshamas are interacting with the nefesh habamis. So he's saying you could argue that the birur of the nefesh habamis, not just the engagement with is a chet, with the nefesh, with the divine, with the soul is affected by the chet. That's the lower level, but also the birur, you could say, is primarily happening on that level, because that's where the neshamas come down below in order to cause a birur from the bottom up. What means from the bottom up? It means that the neshama has engaged with. You're not bringing down elikus from the top down. You're not bringing elikus and saying, okay, the nefesh elikis in its great power is shining to the extent that it's impacting the animal soul. But you're talking about going and engaging with the animal soul on its terms. Tfisa means it's contained there. And that it manifests. So we're talking here the lower level. Now this is a long, drawn out phrase. So let me just put it into context. What he's going to be saying here is that the birur actually does come from a higher level. Even though you can say, yesh leimer, that it's engaging on that same lower level, not on the higher level. And he's now explaining why you could say that. But the end of the story is going to be that it is coming from a higher level. I'm just looking, where does he finally finish it? I think it's closer to the end of the parentheses. So don't get confused by the whole flow here. Right now, he's coming to say that even though you could say that this engagement, this refinement is also happening on the level of biyah, because that's where the birur happens. Mamat l'mayla. Mashen kain, b'neshamas hagvayes, but higher souls, that's not how it works. When it comes to higher souls, their birur is from the top down. And yes, this will be connected to Torah and Tefillah and everything we've been learning from page 1350 and on. I'll get back to that. But you could argue that there's two different types of neshamas, and not just argue, that is true. One is a neshama that engages with existence, manifests within it, and the refinement is from the bottom up. That would be like us. And then there's higher level souls that is their birur is mamayla mata. They don't engage with the world quite. They're not mislapsh. That's like a neshama of Atzilus, the Oves, the patriarchs, or even more Moshe Rabbeinu. Their work is they come into the world and their powerful light does the refinement. It's not that engaging with the lower levels. This is all a consideration. He's not going to conclude this way, but this is all a consideration. The commission is become a duchtin, like we learned earlier, it's explained earlier in a number of discourses. The neshamis, the biyah, hein shenitfosim begeshem, that the neshamis of bri yitzir asiyah, they're the ones that anitfosim, which means they're contained and they're defined by the geshem. V'nikroim, what do they call those souls? Evdi Hashem begufam. They serve God with their bodies, whereas neshamas hagveyes, the higher souls, ubafrat neshamas da'atzilus, and specifically souls of Atzilus, einim nitfosim begeshem. They are not contained. They manifest inside of a body, which means Avram Avinu had a body, Moshe had a body, but the body does not define them. The body is not their primary force. The body is just a vehicle for them. They're not nitfosim. V'heim b'bchinas evdi Hashem b'nishmosam. They are in a state which is called, they serve God with their soul. The soul is the driving force. Whereas the other neshamas, most of the neshamas, the body is the driving force, and there's a soul that's contained in there and defined by it. And he continues in explaining the difference between these two. As I said, if you're not following completely, I will explain it all, but I want to read the whole thing before I come back to discussing the whole context. Ukamoi, I have the chayil the Shabbos. This difference, but these two types of souls, is like the difference between the weekday and Shabbos. Shaveda the chayil he be inyan abirudim. The work in the chayil in the weekdays is birudim that were involved in material existence. And our job is to draw out the divine sparks through our work, through all the lamates malachis, the 39 types of work, and everything that we're engaged in weekdays, in mundane life. That's why birudim are in the weekdays. Shabbos, you're not supposed to do birudim. You're not supposed to separate the good from the bad. Mashenka b'Shabbos the beirer asur. In Shabbos, beirer to separate is not allowed. Like food, from take out kernels or take out seed, take the food from the shell. The ozu aveda is neshama atzma. The Shabbos, the aveda is the neshama itself. It's not the work of extracting sparks from the material. That's why kol malachta asuya. We're not supposed to do work on Shabbos. Misha tarach be'erev Shabbos. But you prepare the food, you prepare everything before Shabbos, because Shabbos is the time of pleasure, of enjoying and experiencing spiritual delight. In the weekdays is the work of refining the material world. So he's comparing that to the two levels of souls. Obviously, it's not exactly because all souls experience Shabbos, but it's similar to the idea that their neshamas that mamata lamaila is more weekday, lamaila lamata is more Shabbos. So that's the comparison here. V'ayim is barely ill, and delve into what we learned earlier. This is the end of volume 2. Be'inyan beirer eichel metech apselis or beirer eichel metech eichel. So there he explained that in Shabbos itself there are also two levels. Beirer eichel metech apselis is not allowed on Shabbos. You can't take food out of the shells, out of waste, out of the shells or the husks and so on. But there's beirer eichel metech eichel. You could, let's say, take a piece of challah and you can cut a piece of challah from another piece of challah. We do that. You're allowed to cut up food on Shabbos. You're just not allowed to separate from two different categories. So he explains there that there's Shabbos, there's birudim, but it's only eichel metech eichel, kedusha from within kedusha, not kedusha from klipa. And then there's a level of Shabbos that's higher than birudim altogether, a third level. She's not addressing here. He's just referring to that. So you see that, okay. V'yadua the Shabbos of b'chinas atzilus, and it's no Shabbos is the level of atzilus. So therefore, you can compare Shabbos to the weekdays, similar to the neshamas gavoyas, the higher neshamas that are from atzilus, compared to the neshamas in biyah. So what do we just say all here? Well, the whole piece so far, to sum up, that what he's saying is that you could say that the birur of the animal soul is primarily the work of the lower souls, like the work of the weekdays. Nevertheless, a makom mokem, says the Rebbe Rashab, but nevertheless, gam neshamas that silis esim bir v'tikun aguf v'nefesh habamis. It's not just the lower soul, but also the neshamas of Atzilus that cause a bitter and tikkun, a refinement, clarity, refinement, and repair of the body and the animal soul. It's not just the domain of the lower souls to do that. So why? So he's going to explain how that works based on what we're learning here. Bahainu, how does that work? Those neshamas, we said sechta is the nefesh as its melubeshes mamish, the lower level of the soul. So how do you explain that neshamas that atzilus are engaging in something which is connected to nefesh habamis? V'hainu b'neshama melubeshes beguf. This is referring to the neshama as it manifests in the body. Shezeu b'chinas naran shebeneshama. This is the nefesh ruach neshama within the neshama. Avol b'chinas neshama shalamayla mislapshus haguf beguf. But the level of the soul that's higher than manifesting in the body, not naran, the higher levels. He doesn't say chai yechida, but apparently that's what he's referring to. Or it's the higher levels of nefesh ruach neshama that are not manifesting in the body. They are not felt within the body. They're separate from it. This is the level, this means the level that mazli chazi. When you say, it's a story in the book of Daniel, that they trembled. And when he asked, what did they see? He says, they didn't see mazli chazi, their mazel saw. So there are experiences that we have that are not felt consciously through the body. But the mazel of the neshama sees, shaneshama re'eh l'mayla. The neshama feels something from above. Ein zeh ba behergesh haguf. This does not come, this is not palpably felt in the body. Rak behelam ubebchinas makif. Only in a concealed and a transcendent fashion, or in a removed fashion. Ukemoy hirhurei tshuva. Like the thoughts of tshuva, sheneflim la'odam pisem. That spontaneously, a person suddenly has a feeling of tshuva. Where did it come from? Nothing happened. He didn't experience anything. He didn't feel anything. Suddenly there's a thought of tshuva. So Chassidus says, Kenoida, as it's known, that comes from the mazel. That's the neshama as it's beyond manifesting in the body. In some way, there's some awakening there. Something affects it, and therefore the person has tshuva, but it's not coming from an avodah mamat l'mayla, for sure not, but it's not coming from the neshama as it relates to the guf. Let me finish the parentheses and then we'll unpack it. Ubezeh yesh gam ken chilukim madregas, and in this itself, the impact of neshama to body, even the higher levels, there's also a number of levels. Be'efen hahergish. In the manner of how we feel it. Some people feel it very subtly. Some people barely feel it. Some people feel it very intensely. So there's many levels of how this can happen. Like it says elsewhere. And yet, nevertheless, his galus on neshama b'chinas ava rabba, the revelation of the soul in the state of ava rabba. And now he's going back to the Torah, where we talked about the Hashem Nishma Sodom, that when a person contemplates the neshama, the nefesh alikis atzma, in the words of Torah, connect to the achdus of Hashem, and to the point that it brings the Ava Rabba. Remember, and that Ava Rabba in turn spills over and affects also the animal soul. He says, nevertheless, this Galsa Neshama B'chinas Ava Rabba poil ba'guva nefesh habamis, that's what affects the body and the animal soul, the B'chinas Yishapchech HaSheichel Nehera. A state of transformation of darkness to light. Commission is bar le'il. V'hu b'chinas mamayla lamata. And that's a level from the top down, not from the bottom up. Okay. Now, you may be a little confused what's going on here, so I will explain. And I think once you hear it, it'll be quite clear. So, first of all, what may be a little complicated here is that the Rebbe Rashab quickly changed tracks in this parenthesis, this part of the parentheses, he went back to the original theme of Nefesh Ki Sechta, Nefesh Abamis, which we already have not moved on from, but hasn't been discussed since page 1466. So we need to go back to the Torah on the Mik Hashem Elokeinu Amagbi L'Sheves and the Mittler Rebbe, and what we learned earlier about Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, to understand what he's saying here. Because this parenthesis is clearly referring to that. So I need to bring back that idea and then bring it back to our discussion here. So a few key points, let me make the few key points. Keep in mind, just this needs the whole connection of all these ideas. Why did we begin discussing in the first place that a neshama is affected by a body or not affected by a body? It came to explain Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi. That what? That yesh mi yesh, when a mashpia teaches a student, or the seichel engages with midas, they're commensurate to one another, and the mashpia is influenced because he has to engage, so he's influenced and affected. There's a change before the hashpah and after the hashpah, before the transmission and after. Whereas by godliness, God is not commensurate with us, creator and the creation, and he's not affected. And he gave the two examples of sunlight and the soul's energy. The soul is not affected by it giving energy to the body. It doesn't make the soul stronger, it doesn't make it weaker. From that, he entered and said, yes, but then there's a level of the soul that does get affected. Not that it makes the soul weaker or stronger, the soul continues to energize the body. But we see that pain and pleasure of the body, or what he called mikre haguf, experiences of the body do affect the nefesh. How do you reconcile the two? We said before it doesn't affect. And that was the example for godliness, that godliness is not affected. So he said on the previous page, we have to say both are true. And the answer is, depending what level of the soul. The soul as it manifests within the body, within the blood, damu nefesh. So the gashmis of the ruchnis of the soul manifests into the ruchnis of the gashmis of the body. There, that interaction does have effect. What he called ha'ara, the ha'ara of the koyach hapoel benifel. But that effect is not an effect on the etzem neshama. It's only due to the slapshus. Because there's a higher level where the nefesh is not affected. What he called etzem ruchni, the different words he gave for it. Okay. But what is all that coming to explain ultimately? And this we'll learn a lot later, more at length, especially in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, that godliness also has two dimensions. The godliness itself is higher than shinui. And this can be explained to the animal soul. And then there's a level of godliness, koyach hapel benifel, that at least when it's manifesting in existence, there is a relationship and there's an impact. We'll learn about that more in the next pages. What's ultimately we're going to derive from all this? That the animal soul can be impacted by all of this. First of all, the fact is, the animal soul, we know now, is not detached from the divine soul on the lower levels. They interact with each other. So then anything that happens on, just like the animal soul or the body can cause pain and pleasure to the neshama, the nefesh can cause pain and pleasure to the body, like we learned. So that would tell us that if the nefesh alikis takes over and really gets consumed with godliness and love for godliness, it can impact the animal soul. That's one thing we learn from this. Another thing we learn from this is that the animal soul can appreciate and understand both things, the godliness that's beyond change and the godliness that engages in existence and has some impact on each other, like it is with the nefesh and the guf. So all this is something that the animal soul can be engaged with. At the same time, there is a level that's beyond the animal soul, that's beyond the guf, that's not impacted. So to bring it back now to the parenthesis that we're learning, what he's saying essentially is this, that the effect of chet, or like he called it in the beginning of the parentheses, just to go back, he said that with the neshama nimsheches achar haguf, that's a lower level of the soul. That's not a higher level of the soul, obviously. Chet. Like he says from Ageres HaKedesh, that during a chet, there's a stalkus of Atzilus is removed, is not engaged in that. But Amnon, But now, what about impacting on the animal soul? When we have to impact on the animal soul, what do we need to do to achieve that? So he says, initially you could say that maybe to achieve that, you also are only engaging with the nefesh that relates to the body and to the animal soul. Ima yesh leimer, that's primarily for neshamas that are in biyah, and only part of the neshama that engages with the animal soul, not the higher parts of the neshama. You could argue that, but he says that's not the case, because you see in Torah what does he say? The psila, the wick of the divine soul, and its contemplation on godliness, on Shema Yisrael, and on Baruch Shem, leads to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, and that in turn impacts the animal soul. So you see, it's not just the nefesh as it's relating only to the animal soul. It's also higher levels of the nefesh. Like he just said, the avarabba that comes from the divine soul, Mamayla Lamata. That's also engaging with the animal soul. So there's a level that engages with the animal soul that refines it on its terms. That's where there's a direct impact that the nefesh and the body and animal soul affect each other. But even the levels that are not affected also are involved here. Number one is even the Shamas Atzilus also cause a birur, like he said. So also Shabbos affects the birur. It's takanat lamata lamayla, but it's mamayla lamata. And two, the avarab is poyel baguv nefesh abamis. That's what ultimately transforms the animal soul in a form of mamayla lamata. So you see here that when it comes to the birur, we're not just drawing from the divine soul that relates to that the lower levels that relate, that go into the blood and into the body, but we're also accessing the higher levels, as he just explained at length. So what you see from that is that the themes we're talking about are both connected to the nefesh that relates to the animal soul and also the levels that are higher than that. That's what he's adding here, that I think is going to be, once we understand the whole picture, is going to make things a lot clearer in the effect. That's how I would analyze and explain everything he said here. So bottom line is, you do have a mamata lamaila. That's the nefesh that relates to the animal soul, that's engaging and working with the animal soul. And you have a mamayla lamata, that's the neshama in its own contemplation, how it affects the animal soul from the top down. And that is also going to be extremely relevant, because I believe ner mitzvah v'Torah especially ner mitzvah, is mamata lamaila. And in Torah he says that when the nefesh ner Hashem nishmas adam, it sounds like he doesn't say mamayla lamata literally, but I think the Mittler Rebbe does say that. That's the nefesh alikis itself affecting the animal soul. But that I want to reserve for later, because that's a little more complicated. I just wanted to talk about this parentheses right now. Okay, so this was a pretty big discussion here. I hope it was clear, but I'll stop here regardless of the end of the paragraph and any questions.
Rabbi Jacobson, correct me if this example explains this concept a little bit more. Ultimately, when it comes to the concept of yichud and unity and ahavat Israel, if we're able to, basically, if we have these two levels of neshamot, then if somebody tells us something that we're offended by, or somebody bothers us or does something, then we have the ability to overlook it and tap into the part of our neshama, or our nefesh, as that matter, that is not affected by. So therefore, you could disagree with the person all you want and be offended, but not be offended, and still love them for the core of who they are.
Okay, that works.
I mean, that, you know what I mean? And I think that's the key to the tzaddik. These guys are on that level at all times. We're not, but that doesn't mean that we cannot tap into that by setting aside our differences on the surface and really love the other person for the core of who they are. And that's tapping to this higher level of nefesh or neshama.
That works. I would just add on the other end, that's why, but on the other end, you need to have neshamas of biyah that do come down and engage on that level. So there, you need to have an element of being removed and above it all, but there's also a level where you do engage in a very internal way, and you do feel the pain and pleasure of that entity, because you're engaging with it. I think both are necessary, which is really what he's saying here. You need to have the nefesh that engages, like the teacher that engages with a student that needs particular, let's say, help. And then there's the teacher that's a little higher than that and is able to elevate the student to a higher level. That's what I would add to what you're saying.
Thank you.
I have a question about this Inyan where he says, and he's giving an example, the hirhare tshuva, shenofel pisam, that this aspect of the soul that is, he says it's more makif. I don't know. Is he saying that that's the way that we get these pangs to do tshuva? Because I mean, I'm just speaking for myself. By me, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and I know when I don't do what I'm supposed to be doing, and that's kind of a pretty rational calculation, and it doesn't just fall upon me as if like, wonder where this came from. I mean, it's pretty clear that that's the whole. I mean, even in Elo Cheshbon HaNefesh, I mean, it's a very rational calculation. So I'm a little confused by that. Both as a mashal and both. What is he saying intrinsically, so substantively?
Well, the context here is pretty straightforward. He's trying to explain that there are levels of nefesh that are engaged with the body, and we consciously, let's say a person sits down and contemplates in the month of El that the mistakes they made, they want to repair, they want to ask forgiveness, they want to improve. That's the nefesh as it relates to the guf, and there's a very conscious experience going on, very deliberate accountability and introspection, soul search. Then there are things that come from higher levels of the nefesh that do not manifest in the body quite. Not nefesh, ruach, and neshama. They come from the mazel of the neshama. That means that's more like subconscious, or we call it superconscious soul experiences that a person, without any effort, suddenly you wake up one morning and you're crying, or suddenly you feel a pang of existential loneliness, or something like that, without any particular avodah that is, we call it conscious avodah. That's what he's referring to. He wants to explain that there are experiences, nefesh experiences, that are detached from, that are not manifesting neshama beguf, like the lower levels, like choil, or the weekdays, or the birurim mamata lamayla. That's more of a mamayla lamata experience.
Oh, okay.
Like a moment of grace,
now.
like a moment of grace, like a moment of grace where God, or something in the nefesh that it can come from anywhere or can come from nowhere. It's just what he says, pisem. That's essentially what he's saying here, the context here, to explain the two levels.
Thank you. Understood. I mean,
but the big kiddush here is not that there's two levels. That's obvious, and it says it in many places. What he's adding here is that even the higher levels also impact the lower levels, meaning that the avarabba, or like he said, even the higher neshamas also affect the birur and tikkun of the nefesh habamis.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about that. And
okay, fine. So one second. Good. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, and if you want to wait to talk about this later, that's fine. But it's driving me a little. It's bothering me. I read more of the Alter Rebbe's Mimer yesterday, reviewed it more. And he says on this issue of Avarabba that when the Nefesh Elokis engages in that, it almost seems like he says ipso facto, the Nefesh Habahamas can then somehow begin to understand and act and engage in Avarabba. And it's almost like, and maybe I didn't read it correctly, but he's almost saying it's ipso facto. Like, if the Nefesh Elokis does that, then the Nefesh Bahamas will follow in suit. And it's like, I feel like I'm missing the whole trick.
You are. Let me just say this quickly. So if you listen to yesterday's class, go back and the last few classes, I made direct reference to this. I said, when you read the Torah you'll only get a very short point. And that's why, if you remember, I said it's fascinating to see how the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab develop it. Because the Torah just gives us, I read the Torah here in the class. I read that whole piece intentionally. And I explained yesterday why, because I wanted to see how the Alter Rebbe says it. In a Chachma level, he just gives the main points. But as the Mittler Rebbe, especially, and the Rebbe Rashab, that really flesh out how that happens. What indeed causes that effect on Nefesh Habamis. I even explained it in today's class, just I did it quickly in the process. So you really need to learn the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, and the Rebbe Rashab to really understand that whole piece. But I did sum it up today, and I did explain it yesterday a little more at length. So I think if you're just going to read the Torah and then try to go back here, you're going to be missing some key points, because you have to learn the Mittler Rebbe's explanation and the Rebbe Rashab's explanation for that matter. That, which is exactly what we're in the middle of, by the way. The next 10, the rest of Ayin Beis is all about that.
Okay.
The details that the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe does not address Yichudi Lo Yichudi Tata. He does not address Yesh Miyet. I mean, he addresses it very briefly, but does not really explain at all the concept of Shinui, Mikre Haguf, Hispilus. You don't see those words there. He just says there's no Shinui. That he does say. So that's why you need the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab's explanation of the Torah to be able to really understand this.
Understood. Thank you very much.
But if you listen yesterday and today's, I'm very fully aware of this the need to explain the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab. This is the real challenge here, and I've been doing it, but not yet fully because we're still in the middle of learning.
Understood. Thank you very much.
I have a couple questions actually. When it says Masha Ain came, but Nashamas Gavos, does every yid has an atzilus in them, right? Every yid, whether you're Neshama Gavos, a tzaddik, or a Talmud Chacham, or Rosh Yeshiva, versus
Yep.
So doesn't that apply to everybody? Why is the Rebbe making a distinction between Neshamas Gavos? They just that it's more accessible to them, they use it more, but that level.
Why don't you ask the same question? What's the difference between you, me, and a Rebbe? Kairach said, Kol ha'edek deishimim, madu tisnasu. Answer that question, and you'll have your answer. We all are neshamas of Atzilus. We all chelik elokam b'mal mamish. That's what Kairach said to Moshe. Kol ha'edek deishimim. The entire community are holy. So whatever you answer for that, you'll answer your question now. You see the connection or not?
Not exactly.
I can give you the answer, but I'm giving you more than that. I'm giving you the tools that you'll be able to answer it.
I'd rather have it lamata from you.
And I'd rather to be mamat lamayla. You know why? Because then you won't ask it again.
Okay.
When it's mamayla lamata, that's not yours. I have no problem explaining it. It's to me, it's very, very clear. But the fact that you're asked, it's not the first time you've asked this, by the way. Because so you tell me, do you know the difference? What's the difference in you and Neshama of Atzilus? It says in Perek Beis and Tanya, everyone's a chelik elikam b'mal mamish. But most people don't read the second half of the Perek. He speaks why we need tzaddikim, what the role of a tzaddik is if everybody's a chelik elikam b'mal. Remember, he speaks about amaratzim and everybody, their energy goes through the Neshama klolis of the Chochmah Sheba Nefesh and all that. So I think what's missing based on your question is missing on the point of what is the difference between the neshamas. So we all have certain common elements. In Tanya, he says you can't become a tzaddik, right? Clear. Why not? If you have a chelik elikam mamash, why can't you become a tzaddik? And yet he says in chapter 14, which that's where I'm up to nowadays, he says you still have to aspire as much as possible to despise bad things, evil, and so on. So you're really touching upon the essential differences that God created. If you want to make the question broader, everything is atzmos, right? Every fiber of existence is atzmos. So what's the difference between a neshama, chelik elikam b'mal mamish, and koyach ha'atzmos inside of a mosquito? Can you explain that? Mamat l'mayla?
I guess it would be where, well, and a mosquito doesn't have,
Doesn't.
bir or, bechira. But I would say, it would be the level that the revelation, Giloy. What's Giloy in the person is by tzaddik, Asilis is always Giloy.
Yeah, but is Gilui just a superficial thing? No, it's everything. We're fundamentally one, but the level of Gilui is just a technical thing. Some a little more revealed, less revealed. Is that what you have to understand? Is the importance of Gilui. Gilui is not a superficial thing. That's the key thing here to remember.
Okay, I was just saying
anyway,
that
there's a lot more to say on this topic. The bottom line is there's fundamental difference between. I don't have this question for another reason. I know my Nefesh Abamis quite well, and I can't even see anything in common between me and a Rebbe and a Tzaddik and a Moshe and Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. So I don't need any mathematical proofs. I just know it from my animal soul's interests. So with all the chelik elikam emal mamish that we learn about, I think the animal soul is still far louder and much more dominant. Now, maybe you are on that level. Maybe you don't feel enough Shabbamis, so maybe that's why you have this question. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just pointing that out. Is that correct? You have to remember, a tzaddik doesn't have a nefesh Shabbamis.
Yes.
Any temptation, anything that you have that's called ego, self-interest, and so on, doesn't exist by a tzaddik. A tzaddik does not have a yetzer hara altogether, as he says in Tanya. So that to me is already, I would say, quite a big difference. If we were all tzaddikim, we'd have Mashiach here already, right?
Right.
We have no machlekes. We would have no disagreements. We'd have none of what we call golus. All the darkness of this world wouldn't exist. So to me, it's very a balbatish thing here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so the second question was Etzilis, the Madrigas Etzilis Mistalkos Be'es Achet. So let me get this correct. That Etzilis can affect in a positive way, meaning that with this level of poil on the Nefesh Bahamas and bring down levels to arouse in it that the combustion of the Shemin and in the Psila, it can to bring about a love of God, Ava Rabba. Etzilis can affect that. And go down that level. It can reach down so low that it can affect the Nefesh Bahamas. But once the Nefesh Bahamas is in control, so to speak, Atzilus has this ability to remove itself. And so Atzilus is going up and down depending on where we're holding it and revealed in our revealed actions. Makshava Dibur Maisa.
No, that's not how I would put it. The way you have to understand is like this. If you're fighting a battle, and the enemy is strong, so you need to engage the enemy, you need to fight them. But the commander-in-chief realizes, or the generals, the higher, what we call them, the higher echelon of the military understand that if they remain on the front line, they're in danger of being killed. And they can't afford that because they have to manage the battle. So they pull back. They go back behind lines to regroup, to strategize, to refresh, to send reinforcements. Meanwhile, there are military that are on the front lines that continue to fight. So basically, it's like this. The neshama comes down below. Those are the front lines. When there's a chet essentially means that the enemy has won, at least temporarily. So you cannot have the neshama of Atzilus, the part of Atzilus would remain there. It would be terrible. That would be like the people that are your savior are now been trapped among the enemy. So they pull back in order to be able to draw new energy to give you the power to continue fighting. So you really need the battle on two fronts. Engaging, that's the lower levels of the nefesh or the neshamas that are not gavoyas, that engage the front, we'll call it the foot soldiers, the pawns that are on the front lines. But then you need the king and the queen in the back that are giving strength and power, mamaylo lamata, that help that battle So they are, precisely because they're not engaged, they can give you that power. But on the other hand, they can't create a bitul mamata l'mayla because they're not engaged internally. So a neshama from above, it's not enough because you want to make a dira b'tachtenim below and engage with existence, but you want the powers from deeper souls levels. That's the way to look at it. Understood?
Yeah, that's interesting, very interesting, Marshall. But in that sense, I mean, first of all, in the army, the Rebbe famously told Sharon that he was in the Navy and he's the captain of the ship is in the back. He waits till everybody leaves. But Sharon was in the army and he says, Acharai, after me. He leads them into battle. A general in the army is in the front. Patton used to be in the front tank of an army in the battle. You'd lead.
So you're saying my example doesn't work? Is that what you're telling me?
I'm just trying to extend it. It was an excellent example. I just trying to understand this
They're
details.
different parts. They're different times for different things. Trust me, if the enemy is shooting away and controlling, they're not going to let the commander be in the front line. Others will protect him.
So my question was that he goes back.
Look at a chessboard. Look at a chessboard. What happens if the king is too exposed? It's not good. You need to have the others protecting him.
Right?
Does he lead the battle? Of course, he leads it in concept, but he does. But okay, I don't. It's two different aspects of the battle.
Interesting, but he can go back and forth. Atzilus could go to the front line, so to speak, in your analogy, and then retreat to the.
But you don't want Atzilus being held captive by the enemy. You agree?
Right. Yes, absolutely. That's a good. So that's why he has to remove himself when the head happens, because he could be captured, as you said. That I can understand very
and
clearly.
Also fundamentally, kedusha on that level cannot be there with this chet. It's like the father can't be there when the children are fighting. They're just not. It's just not possible.
Right. Interesting. So, but the last question is the Atzilus is still mamali column, and the level of Chaya Yechida, I can understand, is not involved. But what the Rebbe's here is saying that Atzilus is also, even though it's mamale, is sort of, so to speak, in the level of, well, you sort of just answered with the army, Marshal, but that's the one that is not involved in the lower levels of the Naran. The Rebbe speaks about Naran, but what about but also the high in Yechida, I can understand, but also Atzilus is in the neshama, it's in the mamale. So you would think that Atzilus was always to some extent involved and cannot be separated completely from the lower levels, even at the time of
It's all relative. Atzilus compared to Biyah can be seen as Chai Yechida compared to Naran.
I see.
If Nefesh Ruach Neshama is Bri Yitzir Asiya, Atzilus would be Chaya.
What was that last one? If Naran, what would you just say?
If Nefesh Ruach Neshama is Bria Yitzir and Asiya, or Asiya Yitzir Bria, then Atzilus would be Chaya.
Chaya, got you. Okay, thank you. That clears it.
Okay, so let's stop here. End of the paragraph, page 1469. Trust me, we're going to go over this more than once. I have to review this myself many times, understand, because a lot here that can help understand the whole theme. That's what I am taking away from this. Yeah. As I said, I almost feel that the Rebbe Rashab, because this, if you look at the Mittler Rebbe's Maimon, this parentheses really belongs at the much later in the sequence of the narrative. The fact that he's writing it here is only helpful to us because it'll help develop the whole story here. Okay, end of